Imagine a quiet military neighborhood in North Carolina. The year is 1970. Streetlights glow faintly, casting long shadows across manicured lawns. Inside one apartment, silence is suddenly broken by the frantic sound of a man's voice screaming into a telephone. "Help, 535 Castle Drive. Stabbing. My wife and children. Oh my God, they're dying." That voice belonged to Army Surgeon Captain Jeffrey MacDonald, and those words, desperate, panicked, disjointed, would mark the beginning of one of the most haunting and controversial cases in American criminal history. A case that, decades later, still sparks fierce debate. Was Jeffrey MacDonald a grieving husband and father? Or was he a cold-blooded killer who staged one of the most elaborate cover-ups ever attempted? The MacDonald family story didn't begin in tragedy. To outsiders, theirs was the very picture of the American dream. A young, handsome doctor, a beautiful, devoted wife, two angelic little girls and another baby on the way. They lived in Fort Bragg, where the sense of community was tight-knit and proud. Friends described them as the family everyone wanted to be. But behind that picture-perfect frame lurked cracks that no one could see, or perhaps no one wanted to. When tragedy struck in the early hours of February 17, 1970, it was almost cinematic in its brutality. The scene investigators would soon walk into inside that home on Castle Drive was unlike anything even seasoned military police had witnessed. Blood on the walls, overturned furniture, words written in crimson, and 3 innocent lives taken in ways too horrific to imagine. And yet, from the very beginning, something didn't feel right. To truly understand what happened that night, and why this case has divided experts, lawyers, journalists, and ordinary citizens for more than 50 years, we need to step back. We need to explore who the MacDonalds were, how they lived, what their dreams looked like, and how a family so full of promise could collapse into blood and questions. This isn't just the story of a crime. It's the story of an image America once believed in, the flawless family, untouchable by darkness. And it's also the story of how one night destroyed that image forever. Jeffrey Robert MacDonald was born in 1943, raised in Patchogue, Long Island. From the start, he seemed like someone destined to succeed. Popular in school, star of the football team, voted most likely to succeed. He was smart, ambitious, and had the kind of charisma that drew people in. Teachers adored him. Girls admired him. Coaches trusted him. His trajectory looked unstoppable. It was during high school that he met Colette Stevenson, the girl who would later become his wife. Colette was shy, gentle, and thoughtful, a perfect counterbalance to Jeff's confidence and drive. Their relationship bloomed through letters, long conversations, and youthful promises of a future together. After high school, Jeff attended Princeton on a scholarship, while Colette pursued her studies closer to home. Distance tested them, but their bond endured. Eventually, Jeff proposed. By 1963, they were married. To friends and family, it was a storybook romance, the handsome doctor in training and the sweet young bride starting a life together. Soon after came children. First, Kimberly in 1964, then Kristen in 1967. In 1969, they were expecting a third child, a boy they had already chosen a name for, Jeffrey Jr. Their home was filled with toys, children's laughter, and the kind of chaos only young kids bring. Colette embraced motherhood, often described as a patient, nurturing figure who put her family above everything else. Jeff, meanwhile, pursued his medical career, excelling in the Army as a Green Beret surgeon. Neighbors saw them as golden, a beautiful young couple with a promising career, a growing family, and a sense of stability in an unstable world. It was the height of the Vietnam War, and many families at Fort Bragg lived with uncertainty. But the MacDonalds appeared untouched by worry. They were, in many ways, the ideal. And then, just like that, it shattered. In the early hours of February 17, 1970, Jeffrey MacDonald claimed he awoke to screams. According to him, 4 intruders had broken into his home, 3 men and a woman with long blonde hair wearing a floppy hat. The men carried weapons, a club, a knife, an ice pick. The woman chanted chilling words that seemed to echo the era of Manson and Helter Skelter. "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." Jeff claimed he was attacked, beaten, and stabbed, but managed to fight them off. When he regained consciousness, his wife Colette and daughters Kimberly and Kristen were dead, brutally slaughtered in their bedrooms. Colette had been beaten and stabbed dozens of times. Kimberly's small skull was fractured. Kristen, just 2 years old, had been stabbed repeatedly in her tiny chest. Even the unborn child Colette carried didn't survive. To this day, the crime scene photographs are described as some of the most horrifying ever taken in American criminal investigations. The violence was not just murder, it was annihilation. But here's the part that haunted investigators. Jeffrey MacDonald survived. His wounds, while visible, were relatively minor compared to the brutality inflicted on his family. Small punctures, a collapsed lung, but nothing close to the fatal injuries his wife and daughters suffered. From that moment forward, suspicion began to grow. Was Jeff a victim, or was he something else entirely? Before the police could even fully process the crime scene, the case was already dividing people. Some believed Jeff's story about intruders, especially given the strange echoes of the Manson murders that had dominated headlines just months earlier. Others thought his story felt rehearsed, too unbelievable, even staged. One thing was certain: nothing in Fort Bragg would ever be the same again. The MacDonald family's idyllic life before the tragedy had been real, or at least, it seemed that way to everyone who knew them. Friends remembered barbecues, family outings, and quiet evenings where Colette read to her daughters while Jeff studied medical journals. Letters written by Colette to her mother painted a picture of contentment, love, and a home full of energy. But like so many American dreams, this one ended abruptly. And the question that remains, even half a century later, is simple yet devastating. Who killed the MacDonald family? That's where our story begins. A young, thriving family torn apart in their home, a husband's desperate cry for help, and a nation left to ask, was this the work of murderous strangers or the darkest betrayal a family can endure? The answers aren't simple, but as we go deeper, we'll uncover how love, ambition, jealousy, and rage collided in ways that still disturb anyone who dares to look closely. When the first military police officers arrived at 544 Castle Drive just after 3:40 a.m., they were not prepared for what they were about to walk into. The call had come in as a domestic disturbance, something they encountered fairly often in military housing. But nothing could have prepared them for the silence that greeted them as they stepped into the MacDonald home. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. The living room was dim, furniture overturned, a coffee table shattered, and on the hallway wall, written in blood, a single word screamed louder than anything else: pig. It was grotesque, it was chilling, and it immediately evoked the recent Manson family murders in California, where the word pig had been scrawled on walls in blood. The officers exchanged looks, their unease growing. Then they found Jeffrey MacDonald. He was slumped against a bedroom doorway, pale and weak but conscious. He was wearing pajama bottoms, his torso bare, and there were visible injuries, bruises, cuts, blood. He looked dazed but coherent enough to point them toward the bedrooms. That's when the horror became undeniable. In the master bedroom, Colette lay sprawled on the floor, her body covered in blood, her nightgown torn. Her arms had defensive wounds, her chest and abdomen were riddled with stab marks, and her skull had been struck with such force that bone fragments were visible. Next to her, a bloody weapon, a piece of wood that appeared to be a club. In one of the children's rooms, 5-year-old Kimberly was found in her bed. Her head injuries were catastrophic, her tiny skull crushed from blunt force trauma. A pillow was soaked in blood beside her, as if an attempt had been made to smother or silence her before the final blows. 2-year-old Kristen's room was even worse. She had been stabbed repeatedly with such fury that one of the knives pierced through her heart. Her small body was covered in deep wounds, more than 30 in total. A baby bottle lay on the floor near her crib, streaked with blood. It was a scene that defied comprehension. The brutality was excessive, almost ritualistic, and yet some things didn't add up. Jeffrey MacDonald told the MPs and investigators that a group of intruders had broken in 3 men, and a woman with long blonde hair wearing a floppy hat. He described them vividly, one man carrying a club, another with a knife, another with an ice pick. The woman, he said, stood at the foot of his couch chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." He claimed he had been asleep on the couch when he awoke to screams, rushed to fight off the intruders, and then lost consciousness in the struggle. When he came to, his family was gone. It was a story straight out of the Manson trial coverage that dominated news in 1969. Too straight, some investigators thought. As daylight broke, Army CID Criminal Investigation Division agents began examining the scene. Immediately, details troubled them. The living room, where Jeff said he fought with multiple armed intruders, showed surprisingly little evidence of a violent struggle. The couch cushions were slightly displaced. The coffee table was tipped over, but in a neat way, as though carefully placed rather than smashed during a fight. Magazines stacked beneath it were barely disturbed. Forensic investigators noted how staged it looked, as though someone had tried to make it appear chaotic without truly creating chaos. Then there were Jeff's injuries. He had a collapsed lung from a small stab wound, a cut on his abdomen, and some bruises. Painful, yes. Potentially serious, yes. But compared to the overkill inflicted on his wife and daughters, his wounds seemed strangely superficial. One CID agent later described the contrast bluntly. His family was butchered. He looked like he'd been in a scuffle. The blood evidence also raised questions. The MacDonald home was covered in blood, but not randomly. Each family member's blood type was unique, and in the pre-DNA era, blood typing became crucial. Investigators noticed that blood patterns seemed to tell a different story than Jeff. For example, Colette's blood was found in places Jeff claimed not to have been. Kimberly's blood appeared in the master bedroom, even though she supposedly died in her own bed. Kristen's blood trailed down the hallway, suggesting she was moved after being attacked. The puzzle pieces didn't match Jeff's version of events. And then there was the word on the wall, pig. Investigators couldn't shake the feeling that it was a deliberate echo of the Manson case, as if someone wanted them to believe this was the work of cult-like intruders. But it felt too on the nose, too theatrical. Suspicion mounted quietly at first. After all, Jeffrey MacDonald was a respected Army doctor, a Green Beret surgeon. He was intelligent, charming, and had no known history of violence. To accuse him of murdering his own family was almost unthinkable, and yet the crime scene kept whispering otherwise. Neighbors were interviewed. No one recalled strange cars or unknown figures near the MacDonald home that night. No one heard intruders fleeing. What they did hear were muffled screams, then silence. As investigators dug deeper, they also discovered inconsistencies in Jeff's retelling of events. He claimed he fought for his life against multiple attackers, yet his hands showed no defensive cuts. His knuckles weren't bruised. His body bore none of the scrapes one would expect from wrestling with 3 men. And though he claimed he lost consciousness, his memory of the intruders' appearances was oddly precise. Meanwhile, the press descended. This was a story too shocking to ignore. A decorated Army doctor claiming his family was slaughtered by a roaming band of hippie killers. Newspapers played it up, connecting it to the ongoing cultural panic over the Manson family and the perceived rise of drug-fueled violence. To many Americans, Jeff's story sounded plausible. But inside CID headquarters, doubts hardened. Within days, the Army investigators quietly shifted their theory. Jeffrey MacDonald wasn't a victim. He was the prime suspect. The possible motive. They speculated about marital tensions. Letters from Colette to her mother suggested Jeff wasn't always the perfect husband. She wrote about frustrations, about feeling lonely while he worked long hours or pursued his own interests. Friends whispered about affairs, about Jeff enjoying the attention his good looks brought him. Perhaps, investigators thought, an argument had spiraled out of control that night, leading to unspeakable violence. It was a shocking leap, but the evidence seemed to push them that way. Still, one problem remained: how to prove it. The crime scene was chaotic, but it hadn't been secured properly. Military police officers had trampled through rooms, moved items, even smoked cigarettes inside the apartment. Evidence was mishandled. Weapons weren't immediately collected. And in 1970, forensic science wasn't nearly as advanced as it would become decades later. This sloppy handling of evidence would haunt the case forever. Every theory, every suspicion would be met with the same defense. The scene was contaminated. Nothing could be trusted. And so, while CID built its case against Jeff, he returned to work. To his colleagues, he was a grieving father, broken by tragedy. To the investigators, he was a man hiding the darkest secret imaginable. By spring of 1970, the Army was ready to act. They charged Captain Jeffrey MacDonald with the murders of his wife and daughters. The idyllic life of the MacDonald family was gone. What remained was a courtroom battle that would expose secrets, lies, and the fragility of the so-called perfect American family. But this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, twisted, and filled with unexpected turns. The Army wasted no time in bringing formal charges against Captain Jeffrey MacDonald. By May 1970, just 3 months after the murders, he was facing accusations of having slaughtered his wife and 2 young daughters. The setting for the proceedings was Fort Bragg, inside the halls of military justice. What unfolded over the next several months wasn't a trial in the traditional sense. It was an Article 32 hearing, the military's version of a preliminary investigation. Its purpose was to determine whether there was enough evidence to proceed with a court-martial. But for the public, the media, and the grieving families, it looked and felt very much like the beginning of a trial for the crime of the century. From the outset, Jeffrey MacDonald maintained his innocence with absolute confidence. He hired a civilian attorney, Bernard Segel, a sharp, flamboyant Philadelphia lawyer with a flair for theatrics. Segel immediately painted his client as a victim of a witch hunt, an upstanding Army surgeon whose only crime was surviving an attack that claimed the lives of his loved ones. Segel leaned heavily on Jeff's appearance and demeanor. Tall, athletic, articulate, and handsome, Jeff looked every bit the grieving husband and father. He carried himself with poise, never losing his cool, and often appeared on the verge of tears when discussing his wife and children. To many observers, he seemed too polished, too composed. But to others, he looked like the very image of tragedy, tragically misunderstood. The Army prosecutors, on the other hand, tried to build their case on circumstantial evidence. They pointed to the inconsistencies in Jeff's story, the suspiciously staged living room, the relatively minor nature of his wounds compared to the savagery inflicted on his family, and the blood evidence that didn't match his version of events. But as the Article 32 hearing dragged on through the summer of 1970, cracks began to appear, not in Jeff's defense, but in the Army's case. The defense skillfully highlighted the sloppiness of the investigation. CID agents had failed to secure the crime scene properly. Dozens of military personnel and investigators had trampled through the apartment, contaminating evidence. Weapons had been mishandled. Photographs were incomplete. Even fingerprint evidence was compromised. Segel pounced on every mistake. He argued that the Army had rushed to judgment, pinning the crime on Jeff simply because they couldn't find the intruders he described. He reminded the court of the eerie similarities to the Manson murders, which had been dominating headlines just months earlier. Was it really so far-fetched, he asked, that a group of drugged-out hippies might have attacked the MacDonalds in a similar fashion? Then came the moment that shook the hearing. A witness named Helena Stokely took the stand. She was a troubled local woman, well known in Fayetteville for her drug use and strange behavior. And she fit Jeff's description almost exactly. Long blonde hair, floppy hat, boots, and a penchant for hanging around with sketchy men. When questioned, Helena admitted she couldn't remember where she had been the night of the murders. She spoke vaguely about being high on drugs, about running with people who talked about killing pigs. She didn't confess outright to participating in the crime, but her eerie resemblance to Jeff's mysterious female intruder cast doubt on the Army's narrative. Segel seized on Helena like a lifeline. To him, she was proof that Jeff's story wasn't fabricated. Here was a real woman, living in the area, who matched the description of the chanting stranger Jeff claimed he saw. Even her own mother would later tell investigators she suspected Helena had been involved. The Army prosecutors dismissed her testimony as unreliable rambling from a woman fried by drugs, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Throughout the hearing, Jeff MacDonald played his part with perfection. He showed photographs of his family, smiled wistfully when recalling happier times, and insisted he loved his wife and daughters more than life itself. He spoke in detail about the intruders, describing the attack as though replaying a nightmare. Segel hammered home the idea that the Army had no motive. Why would Jeff, a successful doctor with a beautiful family and a baby on the way, suddenly massacre them? There was no financial gain, no insurance scam, no pattern of abuse. The prosecution's theory, that Jeff and Colette had argued that night, and that rage drove him to kill, sounded thin compared to Jeff's vivid account of strangers breaking in. By the fall of 1970, the Article 32 hearing had dragged on for months. When the presiding officer, Colonel Warren Rock, finally delivered his findings, they shocked nearly everyone. He recommended that the charges against Jeffrey MacDonald be dismissed. His reasoning: the evidence against Jeff was insufficient. The crime scene had been compromised. The prosecution's case was built on speculation, and Helena Stokely's appearance, however unreliable, gave enough weight to Jeff's claims about intruders that doubt could not be ignored. Just like that, Jeffrey MacDonald was a free man. For Jeff, it must have felt like vindication. For Colette's family, it was a nightmare. Colette's mother, Mildred Stevenson Cassab, had initially stood by her son-in-law. She believed him when he said intruders had killed her daughter and granddaughters. She defended him publicly, comforted him privately, and even testified in his favor. But as time went on, her faith began to crack. She noticed Jeff seemed oddly detached when talking about the murders. His letters and phone calls lacked the grief she expected. Instead, he seemed eager to move on, to shed the tragedy like a skin. And then came the final straw. In the months after the dismissal, Jeff moved to California to rebuild his life. He threw himself into work, started dadding again, and even appeared on television interviews where he presented himself as both victim and survivor. To Colette's parents, this behavior felt callous, almost monstrous. How could he smile on TV when their daughter and granddaughters lay in graves? Mildred Cassab began to doubt. Her husband, Freddie, doubted too. And when they requested transcripts from the Article 32 hearing, they pored over them obsessively, line by line. The more they read, the more convinced they became that Jeff wasn't telling the truth. The Cassabs, who once defended Jeff to anyone who would listen, transformed into his fiercest enemies. They would spend the next decade pushing relentlessly for justice, determined to see him held accountable. But in 1970, the dismissal seemed final. The Army dropped the case. Jeff walked free. Still, the story didn't die. The murders of the MacDonald family remained a subject of fascination for journalists, crime writers, and the public. Rumors swirled about Helena Stokely and her shadowy friends. Questions lingered about the botched investigation. And quietly, federal prosecutors began keeping an eye on the case, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jeff, meanwhile, built a new life. He settled in Long Beach, California, working as an emergency room physician. Colleagues admired his skill and charm. Patients saw him as a dedicated doctor. To outsiders, he seemed to have triumphed over unimaginable tragedy. But beneath the surface, the storm was gathering. The Kassabs refused to let go. They wrote letters to politicians, contacted journalists, and pushed the Justice Department to reopen the case. Piece by piece, they collected evidence, finding holes in Jeff's story that others had missed, and with each revelation, the momentum shifted. Jeffrey MacDonald may have walked free in 1970, but his freedom was temporary. The law and the ghosts of Castle Drive were not finished with him. When Jeffrey MacDonald walked out of Fort Bragg in late 1970, a free man, it might have seemed like the story was over. For the Army, the case was closed. For the press, the headlines had faded. For Jeff himself, it was an opportunity to begin again, far from the shadow of Castle Drive. But for Freddie and Mildred Kassab, the parents of Colette and grandparents of Kimberly and Kristen, nothing was over. Their daughter and 2 granddaughters had been brutally slaughtered, and the man who was supposed to protect them was now living freely, working as a respected doctor, even appearing on talk shows. The disconnect was unbearable. At first, the Kassabs had defended Jeff. They believed his story about intruders. They told friends and neighbors he was innocent, that he too was a victim. They had sat through the Article 32 hearings, testifying in his defense. But then came the doubts. It started with small things. The way Jeff's letters read more like public relations statements than the raw outpourings of a grieving husband. His calmness on television interviews, where he flashed his smile and leaned into his image as a tragic survivor. His quick pivot to dating other women, as though his marriage and children were simply chapters in a book he had already closed. Mildred once remarked to Freddie, "He doesn't grieve like a man who lost everything." That was when they began to dig. The Kassabs obtained the full transcripts of the Article 32 hearing. They spent night after night reading, highlighting, cross-referencing. Freddie, meticulous and stubborn, turned into a kind of amateur detective. He built timelines, compared Jeff's statements with the forensic evidence, and spotted details even the Army had overlooked. One revelation hit him like a hammer. Jeff claimed he had pulled his pajama top over his hands to ward off the attackers, and that the garment had been punctured repeatedly during the struggle. But when Freddie studied the crime scene reports, he noticed something uncanny. The puncture holes in the pajama top lined up almost perfectly with the stab wounds on Colette's body. To Freddie, this wasn't coincidence. It looked like Jeff had used the pajama top to cover his wife while stabbing her, then spun a story about intruders to explain the holes. The more Freddie found, the more convinced he became. Jeff had lied. From that point on, the Kassabs became crusaders. They contacted the Justice Department, the FBI, and anyone who would listen. They wrote letters to senators, demanding that the case be reopened. They spoke to journalists, urging them to dig deeper. What had once been grief hardened into fury. Meanwhile, Jeff was thriving in California. He took a position at St. Mary's Medical Center in Long Beach, working in the emergency room. Patients admired him for his skill under pressure. Nurses found him charming. His colleagues described him as confident, sometimes cocky, but undeniably talented. He also began to rebuild his personal life. He dated women, traveled, and projected an image of resilience. On television appearances, including a 1970 spot on the Dick Cavett Show, he defended himself eloquently, portraying the Army investigation as a botched witch hunt. He smiled, cracked jokes, and spoke warmly about Colette and the girls, all while emphasizing that he was the real victim. To viewers at home, his demeanor was polarizing. Some saw a man unfairly hounded, clinging to his dignity. Others saw coldness, a lack of true grief. For the Kassabs, it was infuriating. To them, every television appearance was a performance, a calculated effort to control the narrative. Behind the scenes, their persistence was paying off. In 1972, the Army formally closed its case, but the Justice Department quietly picked it up. Federal prosecutors began reviewing the evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and studying the crime scene records. The Kassab's constant pressure ensured the case never slipped into obscurity. One of the key questions investigators asked was simple. If Jeff was innocent, why had his story shifted over time? Originally, he described 4 intruders in great detail, but when inconsistencies were pointed out, his recollections became fuzzier, less certain. At one point, he suggested maybe he had dreamed parts of it. His credibility began to erode. Investigators also re-examined Helena Stokely. She remained a haunting figure on the edges of the case. Sometimes she claimed to have been at the MacDonald home that night, watching as others committed the murders. Other times she denied involvement altogether, saying her memory was clouded by drugs. Her shifting stories made her unreliable, but tantalizing. Still, the core of the case came back to forensics. Even without modern DNA, blood typing painted a damning picture. Each member of the MacDonald family had a different blood type, an investigator's rare stroke of luck. The patterns of where each type appeared told a story, and that story contradicted Jeff's account. Colette's blood was found in multiple rooms, not just the bedroom. Kimberly's blood was discovered in the master bedroom, even though Jeff insisted she had died in her own bed. Kristen's blood led down the hallway, suggesting she had been attacked elsewhere before being moved. And everywhere investigators looked, they saw Jeff's pajama top, its holes, its placement, its connection to Colette's wounds, as a smoking gun. The case that had once seemed flimsy was hardening into something stronger. But building a federal murder case against a man who had already been cleared by the Army wasn't easy. Double jeopardy issues complicated matters, though technically the Article 32 dismissal wasn't a trial and didn't preclude federal prosecution. Still, the political stakes were high. Years passed. The Kassabs refused to relent. They badgered the Justice Department, pushing relentlessly. "He killed them," Freddie would say over and over to anyone who would listen, "and I won't rest until he pays." Finally, in 1974, the U.S. Attorney's Office in North Carolina convened a grand jury to review the case. Witnesses were called. Forensic experts testified. Helena Stokely appeared again, once more weaving her strange tales of memory and forgetfulness. The grand jury deliberated for months. And in January 1975, it happened. Jeffrey MacDonald was indicted on 3 counts of murder in the deaths of his wife and daughters. The indictment sent shockwaves. For 5 years, Jeff had lived as a free man, building his reputation and career. Now, suddenly, he was facing trial for the crime he thought he had escaped. Jeff's reaction was swift and defiant. He declared his innocence, calling the charges outrageous and baseless. His lawyers filed motions to dismiss, arguing that the indictment was unconstitutional, that it violated his right to a speedy trial, and that double jeopardy applied. The legal wrangling began immediately, and it would stretch on for years. The case bounced through the courts, with appeals, delays, and procedural battles dragging it out. Jeff continued working as a doctor, though under the cloud of looming prosecution. He remained outwardly confident, even cocky, telling friends and colleagues he would never be convicted. But the Kassabs didn't waver. To them, the indictment was validation. Their persistence had paid off. Their daughter and granddaughters might finally see justice. As the mid-1970s wore on, the case became a legal labyrinth. It wouldn't reach trial until 1979, 9 years after the murders. In that time, public fascination only grew. Books, magazine articles, and television programs kept the story alive, each retelling fueling the debate. Was Jeff MacDonald a wronged man or a calculating killer? The idyllic image of the MacDonald family, Jeff, Colette, Kimberly, Kristen, and the unborn child they had named Jeffrey Jr., hovered like a ghost over it all. Every photograph of them smiling, every letter Colette had written home, reminded the world of what was lost. And every confident television appearance Jeff made reminded the world of the man who might have taken it all away. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic and contentious murder trials in American history. But before that curtain rose, there would be more twists, more delays, and more questions that no one seemed able to fully answer. By the summer of 1979, nearly a decade had passed since the night of the murders at 544 Castle Drive. For years, the case had been tangled in appeals, delays, and endless motions. But now, at last, Jeffrey MacDonald was going to face a jury of his peers in Raleigh, North Carolina. The trial was expected to be long, grueling, and explosive. National media swarmed the courthouse, sensing history. The story had everything: a handsome doctor, a picture-perfect family, gruesome killings, shadowy hippie intruders, and nearly 10 years of controversy. It was the kind of case that blurred the line between tragedy and spectacle. For the prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney James Blackburn and his team, the strategy was clear: strip away Jeff's polished exterior and show the jury the evidence that had haunted investigators since 1970. This wasn't about mysterious intruders, they argued. This was about a man who snapped, slaughtered his family, and staged an elaborate lie. For the defense, headed once again by Bernard Segel, the goal was equally clear: portray Jeff as the ultimate victim, a man wrongly accused because the Army bungled its investigation. The defense leaned heavily on the contamination of the crime scene, the unreliable witnesses, and the eerie possibility of outsiders like Helena Stokely being involved. The battle lines were drawn. The prosecution began with the crime scene itself. They called forensic experts who explained how the blood evidence told a story far different from Jeff's. Each MacDonald family member had a different blood type. Colette type A, Kimberly type AB, Kristen type O, Jeff type B. This meant investigators could track movements within the house, and what the blood showed was devastating for Jeff. Colette's blood was found in Kristen's room, suggesting she had been attacked there first. Kimberly's blood was found in the master bedroom, even though Jeff insisted she had been killed in her own bed. Kristen's blood trailed down the hallway, indicating she had been carried. To the prosecution, this proved the murders happened in a sequence that matched a domestic explosion, not a chaotic invasion. Then came the pajama top. Experts demonstrated to the jury that the holes in Jeff's torn pajama top matched the stab wounds on Colette's body almost exactly when the shirt was folded in a particular way. To them, this was no coincidence. It meant Jeff had placed the garment over Colette and stabbed through it, later inventing the story about shielding himself with the top. It was chilling, almost mathematical. The shirt became a silent witness against him. The prosecution also attacked Jeff's injuries. While he had a collapsed lung and cuts, doctors testified that his wounds were far less severe than what one would expect from fighting multiple armed attackers. One surgeon even said the injuries looked hesitant, as though self-inflicted or done with controlled intent, not during a life-and-death brawl. They reminded the jury of the lack of real signs of a struggle in the living room. The tipped-over coffee table looked staged. The neat placement of magazines underneath suggested it had been lifted and turned rather than knocked aside in chaos. It was theater, not reality. Then came the most gut-wrenching testimony, the pathologists describing the girls' wounds. The sheer overkill, dozens of stab wounds, blunt force trauma to their tiny bodies, spoke of rage, not a random break-in. The jury listened in silence, some visibly shaken. The defense countered aggressively. Segel hammered the contamination of the crime scene. He reminded jurors that dozens of MPs and investigators had stomped through the apartment, moved items, even smoked inside. Evidence was lost or mishandled. How could the government claim certainty when the foundation of the case was so sloppy? He brought up Helena Stokely again. Though she wasn't a reliable witness, her existence was unnerving. On the stand, she wavered, sometimes saying she thought she was present the night of the murders, sometimes saying she couldn't remember. She admitted she had once owned a floppy hat like the one Jeff described. Segel used her to plant a seed. What if Jeff was telling the truth all along? What if the real killers were still out there? Segel also attacked motive. Why, he asked, would Jeff, successful, respected, with no history of violence, suddenly slaughter his family in such a grotesque way? The prosecution had no solid answer beyond marital tension and possible infidelity. To Segel, that wasn't enough. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is not motive, this is speculation." But the prosecution had more than speculation. They had pattern. They presented evidence that Jeff and Colette's marriage wasn't as idyllic as it seemed. Letters from Colette to her mother painted a portrait of loneliness, frustration, even resentment at times. She complained Jeff was distant, wrapped up in his work, and not always attentive. Witnesses hinted at Jeff's affairs, casual flings that undermined the image of the perfect husband. The prosecution's theory was that an argument erupted that night, possibly over Jeff's fidelity, possibly over the children, and spiraled into violence. Once it began, it escalated beyond control. The overkill, the sheer brutality, was explained as a frenzy, not a plan. And afterward, faced with the wreckage of what he had done, Jeff staged the scene, concocting the story of intruders. It was simple, ugly, and, according to the government, true. As the weeks dragged on, the trial became a battle of impressions as much as facts. Jurors watched Jeff closely. He sat at the defense table, dressed sharply, often expressionless, occasionally flashing a smile. He didn't cry. He didn't break down. He seemed composed, almost too composed. To some jurors, his calmness suggested innocence. To others, it suggested coldness. The defense tried to humanize him, bringing in friends and colleagues who testified to his character. Patients described his compassion. Former classmates recalled his brilliance. To them, Jeff was incapable of such savagery. But the prosecution always came back to the physical evidence. Blood doesn't lie. Pajama tops don't rearrange themselves. Children don't move after they're dead. The climax of the trial came during closing arguments. Prosecutor James Blackburn stood before the jury, his voice steady. He held up photographs of the MacDonald family, the smiling faces of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. Then he contrasted them with the crime scene images, their broken bodies. "This," he said, "is what the defendant did, not intruders, not strangers, the man who was supposed to love and protect them." Segel countered with fire, accusing the government of building a case on junk science and sloppy police work. He reminded the jury of Helena Stokely, of the contamination, of the missing pieces that could never be explained. He painted Jeff as a man destroyed twice, first by killers, then by prosecutors. When the arguments ended, the courtroom was tense. The jury deliberated for 6.5 hours over 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty on all counts of murder. Jeffrey MacDonald, once a celebrated Green Beret surgeon and admired doctor, was convicted of murdering his wife Colette and their 2 daughters. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in federal prison. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Colette's family wept. Jeff's supporters were stunned. He himself showed little visible reaction, maintaining his composure even as his world collapsed. For the Kassabs, the verdict was vindication. Nearly a decade after losing their daughter and granddaughters, justice had finally been served. Freddie said afterward, "I knew he did it. I always knew. Now the world knows too." For Jeff, it was the beginning of a new battle. He proclaimed his innocence, vowing to appeal. He insisted he had been railroaded by corrupt investigators and incompetent prosecutors. To him, the fight wasn't over, it had just begun. And indeed, the case was far from finished. Over the next 40 years, Jeffrey MacDonald would wage one of the longest, most complex appeals campaigns in American legal history. But in that Raleigh courtroom in August 1979, one chapter closed. The golden image of the MacDonald family had been shattered long ago. Now, at least in the eyes of the law, the man responsible had been unmasked. When the gavel came down in August 1979, Jeffrey MacDonald was led away in handcuffs to begin serving 3 consecutive life sentences. But in his mind, the story was not over. Far from it. If anything, the conviction ignited his resolve. He was innocent. He told anyone who would listen, and he would fight until his last breath to clear his name. His defense team immediately launched appeals. They argued that evidence had been mishandled, that key witnesses had been excluded, that the prosecution relied on questionable forensic methods. They also focused on Helena Stokely, the troubled woman who had confessed, then recanted, about being at the MacDonald house that night. To MacDonald's attorneys, Helena was the missing link, proof that outsiders had been involved. But appeal after appeal failed. The courts upheld the conviction. The judges were unmoved. The evidence, they ruled, was overwhelming. Yet the case refused to fade. It had too much drama, too much tragedy, too many unanswered questions. By the early 1980s, the media had rediscovered the MacDonald murders. True crime was becoming a cultural phenomenon, and journalists circled the case like hawks. Books were written, television specials produced. The most infamous of these was Fatal Vision. Author Joe McGinnis had been granted extraordinary access to Jeff during his 1979 trial. Jeff thought McGinnis was on his side, that he would write a book proving his innocence. The two men exchanged letters, shared meals, even became what seemed like friends. Jeff believed McGinnis would help sway public opinion. But when Fatal Vision hit shelves in 1983, it was devastating. The book portrayed MacDonald not as a wronged man, but as a narcissistic, cold-blooded killer who had butchered his family. McGinnis argued that Jeff's charm and composure were a mask, hiding a man capable of monstrous violence. The book became a bestseller, later adapted into a hit TV miniseries. Millions watched, horrified, as the story of the MacDonald murders was dramatized on their screens. For much of America, the case was settled. Jeffrey MacDonald was guilty. The betrayal stung. Jeff sued McGinnis for fraud, claiming the author had pretended to be his ally while secretly believing him guilty. The lawsuit dragged on for years, eventually ending in a settlement. But the damage was irreversible. The cultural narrative had been written, and it painted Jeff as a murderer. Still, Jeff refused to give up. His legal team kept filing motions. They raised new arguments, new evidence, new technicalities. One major angle was Helena Stokely. Over the years, she had given countless interviews and statements. Sometimes she claimed she had been at the MacDonald house the night of the murders. Sometimes she said she was too strung out on drugs to remember. Sometimes she flatly denied it. She was a chaotic witness, unreliable and tragic. She eventually died in 1983, taking her secrets with her. Yet for Jeff's supporters, Helena remained central. They pointed to others in her circle who claimed she had confessed privately. One friend swore Helena said she was present but too high to intervene. Another recalled her weeping about that poor family. But the courts dismissed these accounts as hearsay and inconsistency. Then came the DNA era. In the 1990s, Jeff's lawyers petitioned for new DNA testing on hairs and other biological evidence collected from the crime scene. If the intruders were real, perhaps modern science could finally prove it. Years of testing followed. The results were mixed. Some hairs didn't match Jeff or the victims, but they also couldn't conclusively be tied to anyone else. Crucially, none of the DNA evidence pointed definitively to intruders. For prosecutors, this was confirmation. For the defense, it was fuel. They argued the unknown hairs suggested the presence of outsiders. The stalemate continued. Meanwhile, MacDonald himself became a fixture in the true crime world. He gave interviews from prison, maintaining his innocence with the same calm confidence that had both charmed and unnerved people at his trial. To some, he was compelling, an articulate doctor wronged by a flawed system. To others, he was chilling, a sociopath who still refused to take responsibility. The case attracted high-profile allies. Renowned attorney Alan Dershowitz criticized aspects of the prosecution. Nobel Prize-winning author William Styron once expressed doubts. Organizations devoted to wrongful convictions cited MacDonald's case as an example of tunnel vision by investigators. And yet, each time the case went back to court, the result was the same. The conviction stood. The public fascination only deepened. Fatal Vision spawned debates, counterbooks, and endless documentaries. Some journalists and filmmakers leaned toward Jeff's guilt, highlighting the forensic evidence. Others leaned toward his innocence, focusing on police errors and Helena Stokely's strange presence. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was its longevity. Generations grew up hearing about the murders. The images of the smiling MacDonald family, forever frozen in time, were replayed in every article and documentary. The brutality of the crime never lost its power to shock. For Colette's family, the endless appeals were exhausting. Freddie and Mildred Kassab, once Jeff's greatest defenders, had long since turned against him. They attended hearings, spoke to reporters, and reminded the world of the victims. To them, the case wasn't about theories or books. It was about justice for their daughter and granddaughters. As the years turned into decades, MacDonald aged in prison. The once vibrant surgeon became an older man with thinning hair, glasses, and a weary demeanor. But his insistence never wavered. "I did not kill my family." He filed petitions for parole but refused to admit guilt, which hurt his chances. Parole boards wanted remorse, confession, acknowledgement. Jeff gave none. He wouldn't trade truth as he saw it for freedom. By the 2000s, the case was as much about history as justice. Younger generations of lawyers and journalists revisited the evidence with fresh eyes. Some argued the forensic science of 1970 was primitive and unreliable. Others said the circumstantial picture was airtight, no matter the technology. The debate became endless, a true crime Rorschach test. Was Jeffrey MacDonald a victim of injustice, or the embodiment of evil hiding behind a charming smile? By the late 2010s, MacDonald was still in prison, still appealing, still insisting. His health was failing. He battled cancer and other ailments. His supporters pushed for compassionate release, citing his age and declining condition. Prosecutors opposed it, saying justice must be served regardless of years past. And so the case remained unresolved in the court of public opinion, if not in the legal sense. The MacDonald murders had become more than a crime story. They were a lens into America's obsession with true crime, the fallibility of forensic science, the clash between image and reality. The idyllic family photograph stood in brutal contrast to the crime scene. The trial highlighted the limits of certainty. The decades of appeals exposed the grinding machinery of the justice system. And at the center of it all was Jeffrey MacDonald, brilliant, charming, unyielding, and depending on whom you asked, either a tragic victim or a monstrous killer. The story refused to die because it touched something primal, the horror of betrayal within a family, the terror of violence where safety should exist, and the unsettling possibility that even decades later, truth remains elusive. Epilogue: the case that refuses to die. When the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals denied Jeffrey MacDonald's latest petition in 2012, many observers thought the story had finally run its course. The judges ruled that the new DNA evidence, though intriguing, did not fundamentally alter the case. The conviction stood. But like everything else connected to the MacDonald murders, closure was elusive. In the years following, MacDonald's attorneys pressed on with motions for compassionate release. His prostate cancer had advanced. He suffered from cataracts that clouded his vision, and arthritis gnawed at his joints. By the late 2010s, he was no longer the polished doctor in his courtroom suits, but a frail old man walking slowly through prison corridors. Still, each request was denied. The U.S. Attorney's Office argued that his crimes were too grave, his lack of remorse too glaring. To release him, they said, would dishonor the memories of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. MacDonald supporters disagreed. To them, it was cruel to keep a dying man imprisoned when doubt still hovered over his guilt. Organizations that advocated for the wrongfully convicted pointed to the uncertainties, the mishandled evidence, the inconsistencies in Helena Stokely's statements, the controversial forensic interpretations. They argued that the case was never as airtight as the government insisted. But for Colette's surviving relatives, the denials brought relief. To them, Jeff's imprisonment wasn't cruelty, it was justice. The debate spilled far beyond the courtroom. The case had become a cultural touchstone, revisited again and again by journalists, authors, and filmmakers. In 2012, acclaimed documentary filmmaker Errol Morris published A Wilderness of Error, a sweeping examination of the case. Morris, who had previously exposed wrongful convictions in The Thin Blue Line, leaned toward the idea that MacDonald might have been railroaded. He dissected the forensic evidence, highlighted inconsistencies, and gave new weight to Helena Stokely's confessions. The book reignited debate, sparking podcasts, think pieces, and even a new FX docuseries years later. For those who already believed Jeff was innocent, Morris's work was validation. For those who believed him guilty, it was an infuriating rehashing of old defenses. The fact that both sides could look at the same evidence and reach opposite conclusions only deepened the mystery. Psychologists weighed in, too. Some profilers described MacDonald as a textbook narcissist, charming, articulate, but devoid of genuine empathy. They pointed to his courtroom demeanor, his lack of visible grief, his decades of unwavering denial as signs of a man unwilling or unable to face the truth. Others argued the opposite, that his calmness was a survival mechanism, the composure of a military man trained to suppress emotion. To them, his consistency was proof of sincerity, not guilt. Even after 50 years, the psychological portrait of Jeffrey MacDonald remained as contested as the evidence itself. The case also entered the broader conversation about wrongful convictions in America. Advocates drew parallels to other infamous cases: Sam Shepard, Rubin, Hurricane Carter, the Central Park Five. They argued that tunnel vision and flawed forensic science had doomed MacDonald. Critics pushed back, saying the evidence against him was far stronger than in those cases. This tension, between doubt and certainty, between justice served and justice denied, kept the case alive in the public consciousness. What made the MacDonald murders especially haunting was the stark contrast between the family's image and their fate. Colette, a young mother devoted to her daughters. Kimberly, just 5 years old, shy and sweet. Kristen, only 2, still a baby. The photographs of their smiling faces were impossible to reconcile with the brutality of their deaths. For many, the horror wasn't just the murders themselves, but the idea that the killer could have been their protector. If Jeffrey MacDonald was guilty, it meant that the idyllic picture of family life could hide unthinkable darkness. If he was innocent, it meant the justice system had failed catastrophically, punishing a grieving husband while the real killers escaped. Either way, the case forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, safety, and the limits of certainty. By the 2020s, Jeffrey MacDonald was nearing 80 years old. He remained in federal custody, his health in steady decline. He continued to maintain his innocence in letters, interviews, and court filings. In one interview, his voice weakened but still resolute, he said, "I loved my family. I would never have hurt them. I've spent my life trying to prove that. Maybe one day the truth will come out." But for many, the truth had already been decided in 1979. The MacDonald case lingers because it is, at its heart, unsatisfying. Not in the legal sense, the courts have spoken, but in the human sense. There is no confession to close the loop, no DNA match to confirm an intruder, no absolute resolution. Instead, there is a void filled with endless questions. Was Jeff's story about intruders a desperate lie, or a nightmare ignored by investigators? Were the prosecutors right to call the pajama top the Rosetta Stone of the case, or was it an interpretation stretched too far? Was Helena Stokely a delusional addict, or a doomed witness whose truth was buried by her own unreliability? Each question leads to another, each answer opens another door. In true crime forums, podcasts, and late-night debates, the MacDonald case still comes up. Younger generations who never lived through the trial discover it through documentaries and argue over the same details that divided people 50 years earlier. It has become, in many ways, less about Jeffrey MacDonald himself and more about the larger issues it represents. The fragility of justice, the fallibility of science, the complexity of human behavior. The story endures because it is both extraordinary and familiar. Extraordinary in its brutality, its twists, its decades-long saga. Familiar in its themes of family, betrayal, and the terrifying idea that evil can wear a familiar face. In the end, perhaps the saddest truth is this: nothing can bring back Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. Whatever one believes about Jeffrey MacDonald's guilt or innocence, 3 lives were stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. Their absence is the only certainty. The MacDonald family's idyllic life ended on a rainy February night in 1970, and America has been haunted ever since.